Chinese investment in Africa. Hundreds of billions of dollars spent on roads, schools, hospitals across the continent. Exploitation or just good business? This is Roundtable with me, Matthew Moore. Chinese money builds African infrastructure, while African resources fuel the Chinese economy. Is it a win-win relationship benefiting a continent largely neglected by the West, or is this just a more modern, more palatable form of colonialism?
Copper in Zambia, gold in the Democratic Republic of Congo, oil in Angola. It's a continent rich with natural resources, capable of keeping China's economy booming. Africa has become Beijing's most important trading partner. With the continent's need for infrastructure, how far will Beijing go in its search for resources? And is Africa vulnerable to the colonial domination of its past? This year, China set up its first overseas military base in a strategic port at Djibouti, already home to the US, Japan and France. The move reinforced beliefs that Chinese interests on the continent are as political as they are economic. More than 2,000 Chinese troops are deployed in some of the continent's most dangerous war zones. An estimated 1 million Chinese entrepreneurs are settled on the continent, contributing to China-Africa trade valued at $220 billion. But the relationship has come under increased scrutiny. Having 54 African nations as friends provides strong geopolitical influence for China. But the offer of no-strings aid to a continent in serious need of development has raised suspicions. Chinese companies have come under fire for failing to employ locals and ignoring environmental safeguards. Beijing has also been accused of emboldening corrupt governments, which no longer adhere to the West's calls for reform. There are also suggestions that Chinese investment in the continent may have peaked due to Beijing's economic slowdown and the drop in commodity prices. There is a growing consensus that China's influence on the continent is mutually beneficial. While many in the West had viewed Africa as a troubling source of instability, China saw opportunity. But with ever-shifting global, political and economic factors, how long is this win-win relationship going to last?
Well, joining me at the round table today, Hannah Ryder from Beijing, a diplomat, former head of policy and partnerships for the United Nations Development Programme. She believes that Africa needs to be taking more control in its relationship with China. Stephen Chan, professor at SOAS University of London. He says that cultural and racial issues are a big problem still between China and Africa. And to my left, Xiaolan Fu, professor at the University of Oxford. She says Chinese investment in Africa will continue to expand. And Tam Sang Zhao, an Africa analyst, he believes both sides have much to gain from the partnership. Tam, if I could just start with you. It's very interesting how China became Africa's preeminent business partner, overtaking the United States a few years ago. What do you think was the most important reason that China was able to do that?
Two things. First of all, Matthew, this is a very good program, especially when you look at what is important for Africa and making sure that the narrative of what is happening on the ground comes out in a balanced way. So thank you so much for doing this. But straight to your point, the main reason is that over the years, it would appear that the West has taken things in Africa for granted. It has been seen as a destination for foreign direct investment that has conditions. It has been seen as if Africa had no power, both at international institutions and within the political scenario where the West appeared to influence the outcome of elections in quite a number of countries. But what the Chinese have done, they've come in without any conditions at all. Just saying that they wanted to do business and stay away from politics. So this is probably why the latest Afrobarometer analysis or survey that was done gave a positive indication that more than 63% of Africans viewed Chinese investment in Africa as a positive thing because they are not influencing the political atmosphere within the country.
Hannah Ryder in Beijing, is that always a good thing, this no strings attached kind of attitude?
Well, I think one of the difficulties with regards to African countries so far is that they have not really been in control of the relationship. So they have suggested, many of the governments obviously put out tenders for infrastructure contracts, for example. Those infrastructure contracts are open to Chinese firms to take over and to deliver. However, they don't necessarily exchange experience, for example, on how much labor conditions, what the environmental standards might be for those kinds of contracts. And so the African countries, I think, tend to just be takers, and takers not just with regard to China, but with regards to many other partners.
Steve?
And I think...
Let me just bring in Stephen Chan. Is it not the case that the Chinese are coming in and with their no strings attached policy are making things very easy for governments that are perhaps unsavory or business practices that are not very stringent and so on?
I think you've got to differentiate here between public aid and public direct investment from governmental and Chinese banks working with the government and private investors. Many private investors, of course, have left a very bad taste in many, many African countries. However, I think public assistance, direct government-to-government foreign direct investment, that has been nothing but beneficial for Africa. And I really do want to take issue with the idea that Africa is there lying exposed and naked for exploitation on the part of Chinese hucksters and shysters. There's an awful lot of pushback now in the negotiating postures, not of all African countries, but a country like Angola, for instance, has learned to push back remarkably well. And that's a template, is a model for the future of how African governments can be fully and equally involved in negotiations. So despite some hiccups, and there really were some, that much is true in the early days of this relationship, that's very, very much disappearing now.
Yeah, I want to add 2 points. First is about China taking over the U.S. as the largest trading partner for Africa. In addition to the reason that Tom has mentioned, I think China has experienced very rapid economic growth in the past 40 years. And this growth generated large demand for trade. Now China is the largest trading country in the world. And this growth and through trade generates some spillovers. The demand for Africa, products, and also Africa become a very important market for Chinese export products too. So I think this growth in China, in comparison to the growth, relatively slower growth in U.S. and in Europe, is also one of the important reasons.
Why do you think that African countries look towards China and China managed to eclipse the United States and others?
And also the complementarity in the factory endowments, in industrial structure, and also the relatively more affordable, accessible Chinese products for African market. So one is the industry and the factory endowment. China and Africa are more complementary. China is a manufacturing plant for the world. And Africa has resources and have market. And also they want to upgrade their industry. And while China move to another level, and Africa is trying to fill in that gap that China leaves. So the complementarity and also affordable.
But when you look at the relationship, generally Africa exports resources to China, and China then uses those resources to make more expensive goods.
That was the past relationship, Matthew. Yeah. That was a past relationship. And actually that's changing now because China is changing its own economy. China's moving to be a more consumption-based and service-based economy. So it doesn't plan to be the world's manufacturing powerhouse anymore. So actually the relationship with the African countries has to change dynamically. And China is trying to do that. But the time has come for the African countries to do that themselves. They need to take charge and say, we want to industrialize. This is what we need from the Chinese partnership, and make sure that it works in their favor.
Well, Stephen,
Yeah,
yes, please go on.
Sorry, I think this China-Africa relationship could be managed even better in a way that one of my research on foreign direct investment multinationals in Africa and looking at whether they provide training and knowledge transfer to the local workers and the partners, business suppliers. And this happened in one of the Chinese multinational, but not in the Western multinational. The reason is we have done interview in both firms, and they said the local government doesn't require us to provide training, and the Chinese multinational did because they borrow money from the Chinese state-owned bank. One of the conditions is that they must provide training to local firms. And while the Western multinational also mentioned that in Southeast Asia, the local government required us to train local workers. And while in Africa, the government has not put this request forward. So this is one of the areas to raise more awareness, and they can make.
Yeah, come in.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's already that realization, like what Hannah was saying, like what she's saying, because the main issue is President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya did realize that when he was talking about the railway program from Mombasa, this is something that was initiated by Kenya, where the Chinese came in and just put in their bid through the tender process. But that actually goes into what they're trying to do in linking China with the rest of the world. So we might see a reduction in terms of money that is available from China to the rest of the world, and Africa included. So Africa needs to manage these things. But Uhuru Kenyatta was clear to say the trade deficit, the direction in which it's going now, needs to change, and change very quickly. So although the conditions on the ground imply that there will be a change, Africa will find itself competing for that same Chinese investment with the United Kingdom for HS2.
You see that coming into play,
other
Stephen?
countries.
Yes, no, I think that's 100% correct. In fact, it's part of a whole global trend, a protest, as it were, against the terms of trade and the balance of trade. So it's not just Africa, it's not just the United States, for instance, a key part of Mr. Trump's policies, but everyone is looking at that balance of trade, and there's a deficit that's very, very much in the Chinese favor. As Africa does begin to industrialize, then of course that is going to change. And I think that it's very much a key leitmotif of the future African industrialization, of course, with problems that will also bring. And I think the Chinese have gotten over slowly. I think I have to admit it has been slow. And an initial reluctance at technology transfer. I think it is now totally correct to say that they're looking very seriously at training and at technology transfer. But
so actually, you all seem to be in agreement that the relationship needs to be rebalanced, but is largely positive.
I think it's largely positive, and it's been around for a long time. We're very alarmed now in the West about the current phase, which is very much driven along financial, technological, and trading lines. But the Chinese were there at the very beginning of several liberation movements, for instance, giving freely of their assistance to countries wanting to become independent. That kind of solidarity has not been forgotten in Africa.
We seem to be migrating towards more the political and geopolitical and strategic areas. Let's do that then. We've seen China set up its first permanent naval base outside of the country at Djibouti. Tell us a little bit about that, and is this the beginning of a greater footprint for China in the continent?
In fact, in Djibouti, you've got now a small country which is home to more than one naval base from more than one great power. Everybody and his dog seems to want to get into Djibouti because of its very strategic location. For the Chinese, it makes a very great deal of sense in terms of having that kind of facility for its maritime Silk route. which of course has alarmed the United States because it means the further deployment of the Chinese Navy. But what you've got there is in fact something which is driven by a maritime trade route in the first instance. And so a naval capacity is very, very much designed along old-fashioned geostrategic lines to protect an expanding trade route, which will have the benefit of linking up a huge number of countries into a more coherent global economy.
Dan, do you think this will affect the non-interference policy that China has had?
There's no doubt, because the area where they are going into, you're already talking about the American bases there, the Russians are trying to go in, you've got Saudi Arabia not far away. Of course, Qatar has just moved out of the area because of the problems that they are having when they were doing the conflict resolution between Djibouti and Eritrea. So what it then means is these bases and that route, that trade maritime route needs to be secured, because China wants to go around the Horn of Africa and down to Cape Town to make sure that they service the greater part of Africa. That will mean that security will need to follow. And then if security follows, then you're going into politics. They've got a seat at the
And what is
United
your
Nations.
concern about that?
The concern will be the conflict. It is always about whether the Americans will allow the Chinese to exert that influence beyond their own waters when you're already having problems in the South China Sea and everywhere else. And for them to have access to Mozambican or South African or Somalian waters, they will need to engage the local governments. So you are now seeing the Americans, for instance, having a presence in Somalia when they left during Bill Clinton's days. So you are invariably going to have the Chinese becoming more and more involved in the politics of Africa because of their economic
Hannah,
interests.
is that something that concerns you?
Not particularly. You know, I recently wrote an article responding to one of the typical narratives around China about colonial power, or will China be the new colonial power, whether through these security or political impacts. And, I did that because I wanted to try to cut that narrative away, because what it does is actually reduce the idea of colonialism, reduce the reality of colonialism that African countries and others face. What China is really trying to do, and I'm no apologist for China, don't get me wrong, but what I do believe China is trying to do is to set up very clear economic relationships, and those have to be security. It's that simple. And so those are quite economic interests. I'm an economist. I believe that's what's at the back of it.
Stephen, how do you think this narrative about China might be moving in the sort of neo-colonial kind of way towards Africa? How did that really get some traction?
I think that's to a certain extent, I want to use the word very advisedly, a form of propaganda based on Western interests. I mean, we ourselves were the first colonialists in Africa. And now that someone else is taking a bite of what was meant to be our pie, we're becoming very, very alarmed. And
there are some examples, aren't there, of high-handedness by the Chinese. For example, in Zambia, we had in 2011 Michael Sata there winning the presidency largely on anti-Chinese sentiment because the Chinese managers shot protesters at a coal mine. There are other examples, but the Nigerian governor of the central bank back in 2013 saying, we have to recognize that China is just like Russia, Britain, Brazil and the rest. They're not in Africa for our interest, they're in this continent for their own interests.
They're certainly in the continent for their own interests, but there's some mutual benefit which can be even so extracted from that kind of self-interest.
And that is
Exactly.
It's a completely different kind of relationship to a colonial relationship. Colonial is oppressive. You know, you have curfews. You had people who were taken to prison. People, extrajudicial killings all of the time. That is
you don't
not
have those
the same
things in
as
Sudan and Zimbabwe? I mean, China seems happy to deal with, I mean, let's not say it's a mirror of colonialism today, but they're still working with
those aren't
oppressive
controlled by China.
regimes.
But I don't think we should let one individual incident or a few individual incidents to reflect the whole picture. The whole picture, I think non-interference is a basic fundamental foreign relations principle for China, it's unlikely to change, very unlikely to change this principle.
If modern colonialism is the Chinese working with the top officials in a country who are possibly autocrats or dictators and bribing them, and the benefits of that relationship don't feed down to the ordinary people, isn't that a form of modern colonialization? By which I mean Sudan, Zimbabwe and others.
I don't think Chinese governmental firms work with the current government to bribe them in order to block. That's not China's intention. That's their domestic institutional problem, political problem, corruption. This should be tackled, but this should be tackled by the African people, their own domestic political system.
The Chinese don't bear responsibility for giving vast bribes to the African leaders and African officials?
I mean, the evidence goes against that, Matthew.
You're saying that there aren't big bribes going to Africans from Chinese?
Look, we are talking about tender processes.
Tender?
Yeah.
Okay.
When most of these governments have laws in place where if you want to submit a tender for anything, any project beyond, let's say, $1 million or whatever, there is a process. And what appears to happen with Chinese companies in particular is where you have joint ventures, maybe some local people having their own companies and then inviting some Chinese companies who are able to compete globally. And remember, these are the same companies that will also win tenders in France, in America, in Germany, in the United Kingdom. So it becomes difficult to argue that the same company that will be winning a tender to run Hinkle power plant in the United Kingdom should not be able to do that in Zimbabwe or Ethiopia because you don't like the leader in Ethiopia or in Zimbabwe at the time. And what I think is more problematic for Africa with these Chinese deals is this is money that is not coming for free. There are terms. Some of the terms and the payments will be required way down. So some generations will then realize that 30 years ago, we signed a deal, maybe some concessions, and now we are required to pay back. That debt 50, 40 years down the line will hurt the other generations who have nothing to do with the deals that are being signed.
Okay, let's look at the final...
This is another aspect. Sorry, just to add to that. The other aspect is the environmental cost. So there are many Chinese companies, of course, who are engaging in providing energy and other types of high carbon infrastructure in African countries. But this is also where the Chinese companies can take extra responsibility, and the Chinese government...
We have a bit of a timing issue here, Hannah. We're running out of time. And the last question ought to be the fact that we're seeing some reports anyway that the relationship has peaked in terms of private investment and many thousands of Chinese now leaving countries like Angola. But let's look at the reason for that. Hannah, while we're with you, just very briefly, do you think the relationship has peaked, or is this a temporary stumbling block?
The relationship is changing. Now foreign direct investment is going into Africa. The trade relationship is likely to be reducing, the number of infrastructure contracts reducing, but foreign direct investment is increasing.
And Stephen, it's not just that, is it? It's China's own economy.
China is going to be rebalancing its relationships with the outside world, not just with Africa, with all of the Western countries, for instance. The Chinese economy is going through a process of, let us say, self-correction after having been in danger of overheating. So you're seeing some volatility, certainly, but I think it's going to be business as usual throughout the world, not just Africa, with a very, very large Chinese footprint for a long time in the future.
Xiaolan, do you see it going steadily up, or has it now reached its maximum?
I think it will continue to increase trade relationship and foreign direct investment. China is now its own economy is going through a transition, industrial upgrading and the industrial structural change. So it's changing a more consumer-based service economy and also high value-added manufacturing instead of labor-intensive, resource-intensive manufacturing. So the country is going through this transition, and also this will, generate a lot of trade economic relationship rebalancing and change its economic relationship with the rest of the world?
I think it will change. It will continue to change because Africa is developing capacity to negotiate better deals. We've already had, like Stephen's saying, Angola has pushed back on a lot of things. There will be more training that will be given to a lot of African countries and new graduates coming up. But also the Chinese model in a 5 years' time might change because they want more money for the Silk Route, to be able to do the maritime, the road and the railway route. So they might want to rechannel that money. So because most of the companies that are investing, whether they are state-owned or privately owned, they depend on the state to guarantee that their investments will be secure.
Tamsin Zhou, thank you very much for your contribution. Xiaolin Fu, Stephen Chan and Hannah Ryder in Beijing. Thank you all very much for your contributions to the Roundtable today. Appreciate it very much. Thank you. Now, the flow of Chinese investment into Africa looks unlikely to dry up. It's down to African leaders and business people to turn that investment into positive growth for the continent. This has been Roundtable with me, Matthew Moore. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.